Ah, Zayne, what should I do with you? Don't you just love when a character is so delightfully difficult to make theories on? I know I do. Let me tell you, if Zayne wasn't always the one jock that gives me the hardest time when it comes to theory making, he wouldn't be my favorite. And I'm happy to announce that with Demo 2 he confirmed both titles. When it comes to new things we've learned about him, it has been quite surprising to see that Zayne seems a lot more grounded of a person than he initially appeared to be. And perhaps that was the point, as we will soon see. For example, when Zayne is at the cafeteria with Ace, the basketball player makes mention of how he's actually a pretty good cook. Perhaps unsurprisingly so, since his quick answer to the question "can you cook?" was "call me Master Chef." This notion already paints Zayne in a bit of a different light compared to the first impression he tends to give when he's decked off in his expensive clothes and dangling with his golden jewels. If Zayne knows how to cook, presumably quite well, then it's probable he might not be the kind of overly rich kid that never lifted a finger in his life, kinda like Felix in Camp Buddy. This could perhaps be attributed to Zayne himself being willing to learn these life skills, or perhaps it might speak of a Zayne that wasn't always as rich like he is now. But regardless of which one of these two scenarios it is, it does paint Zayne as a person that has his feet firmly on the ground, rather than having his head in the clouds of money like one might initially think. To further drive in the point of deceiving appearance, most of the choices that increase his affection in Demo 2 are in some ways tied to the catching of feelings and making the experiences actually special, which are in total contrast to his reputation as a heartthrob, which is usually a label assigned to people that don't care about making experiences with romantic and sexual partners particularly special. I think this general shift in the way he gets perceived is perfectly demonstrated by Zayne's scene with Leo at the library, where a star basketball player is shown not only to have what seems a genuine nurturing side in regards of Leo, but also has enough knowledge on programming to be very good at explaining the subject. As you can see, this kinda conflicts with the rich and out of touch boy stereotype one might initially label Zayne as. Contrary to the stereotype, in fact, Zayne clearly has good enough understanding of others' emotion, and the fact that he is not only skilled in cooking but also has knowledge on programming, which by all accounts is something that would be defined as nerding and not befitting of a star the kind of Zayne's, does a great deal in humanizing him and not making him look like a larger-than-life kind of figure. If you've played through Zayne's route in Demo 2, then you have probably been anticipating the Wednesday confession event for a while now. In case you need a refresher, these events happens at night in front of the campus gate, where a random girl Zayne doesn't even know has waited for him to show up the entire day just so she can make a love confession, which Zayne gently rebuts, but the girl doesn't take it well and runs off crying. This clearly upsets Zayne, and it's quite evident since when Ace says "you don't seem fine", Zayne concedes and starts thinking about what happened, basically indirectly admitting he wasn't indifferent to what just went down. Which is again another show how Zayne does care and understands other people's feelings. The conversation between the two of them then evolves into Ace pointing out that Zayne spreading kisses like honey with his usual flirtatious way might just end up creating false hope and, most likely, a parasocial relationship with his fans, making them feel as if they know him more than they actually do. This kinda implies that Zayne is partially at fault for fueling this cycle, but Ace, rightfully so, reassures Zayne that it's different when you mean it. Which, in turn, presents an interesting conundrum, because it really highlights how perhaps Zayne coming off as insincere might be a theme of his relationship with Ace. If you think about it, we already saw it time and time again how Zayne's constant flirting makes Ace oftentimes second guess his intention, and once they start to actually get serious, this might actually become a real and interesting conflict between the two of them, with Ace not being able to understand when Zayne is being serious and when he's being flirty. So this constant second guessing might become one of the elements that will slowly put a strain on the relationship over the course of the game. Going back to the Wednesday event, the conversation tapers off shortly after, leaving us with not much else to analyze, but like all the solo Wednesday events, this encounter has allowed us to understand for certain which is the initial problem at the core of the love interest in question. In Zayne's case, it seems to be centered around the way other people perceive him, and how that oftentimes seems to clash with who he actually is. Besides the aforementioned, in fact I think there might be one more case in Demo 2 of Zayne's reputation preceding him for the worst. In a rather blink and you'll miss it moment, after Zayne and Ace are done recording their scene, Zayne very briefly says, "Today was a first for me too," before quickly changing the conversation topic. This phrase is as interesting as it is hard to unpack, due to the absolute lack of context there is around it. Depending on how you decide to interpret it, the meaning will vary quite a bit. The most extreme and perhaps immediate interpretation of this quote assumes that by "a first," Zayne means that he, like Ace, ended up losing his V-card on this occasion, which is certainly interesting, but the exact wording defining "a first" makes me wary of saying that Zayne being a virgin at the start of the game is something we should expect for certain. For the simple reason that, as we saw in the closet scene, Zayne does seem to have experience when it comes to moving into a sexual situation, considering how good he is at flirting and teasing. So, if we assume that Zayne isn't a total virgin, perhaps we could assume that by "a first" he meant his first time with a guy? After all, Zayne is heavily implied to be bisexual, so maybe he only had sex with women before and that's the reason why he joined Jock Studio, to have sex with a guy. But even then, surely there were easier way of going about it than joining a secret porn club that could get you expelled if you ever get discovered. Surely it'd be easier to just organize a hookup on a dating app. You just match a guy, agree on a time and boom, problem solved. Unless there is something that makes hooking up with a guy difficult. Something that perhaps is extraordinary, that makes finding a sex partner a hard task or a big problem. But it's not like Zayne has anything like that, or does he? I think it's not clear where I'm going with this. No matter how you spin the "at first" Zayne makes mention of, it does carry one undeniable consequence that doesn't change no matter the interpretation one gives to it. Be that he never had sex before, or that he might simply not have gotten a blowjob in the past, the fact that him and Ace had a first together implies that Zayne has a level of sexual experience that is at least a lot lower than what people, me included, might have initially predicted. Which is nothing short of very surprising, considering that even the official website describes him as a heartthrob, but the description only reports it as a rumor, and thus not something necessarily true. And when you think about it, it shouldn't be that much of a surprise that Zayne would develop this kind of reputation, regardless of his actual body count. We know very well how he likes to flirt and tease everyone that he comes across, and considering how head over heels all of his fans are for him, it wouldn't be surprising that reports of him being just a bit flirty would spiral into rumors that he's a full-on playboy, which at this point is clear that he is not, and I dare anyone with 25 centimeters worth of snake among their legs to have a high body count, because as much as big dicks might be glamorized, they are not easy to wield and even less easy to take up your ass or pussy. Granted, in the Blitzverse, when it comes to asses at least, it seems they are some kind of pocket dimension capable of taking in anything that comes their way, so this motive might not end up being the exact reason why Zayne has a hard time having sex as often as his reputation might suggest. Instead, maybe he's just too busy to regularly have hookups. But regardless of the exact motivation, I think I've made it clear by now that when it comes to in-bed experience, Zayne isn't up there among our cast. This ties back into the theme of how he's always somebody that is very much preceded by his own reputation. Everybody thinks of him as a rich, popular and perhaps somewhat full of himself playboy. Yet although he's rich and popular, he's not full of himself, and neither is a playboy. But rather, he's actually a nice guy that sure he likes to tease people, but he's also seeking for himself a real and special connection with someone that is just as special for him. And that's why he joined Jock Studio. No, wait, that ain't right. People don't join porn clubs to find romance. Then he must have joined because he wants to have more sex. But even that sounds like a legitimately stupid move. As I said in my homophobia video, Zayne joining a porn club is, for him, a massive risk, considering his status as the star basketball player of Olympus University. And if his sole reason for doing so is that he's just horny, then he'll be a real dumbass for risking both expulsion and his basketball career as a whole because he wants to follow his balls. So what is his reason? He doesn't need the money, he doesn't need the fame, and he cannot afford to risk losing his basketball career due to a porn scandal he brought upon himself just because he's horny. Which leaves us with what? Surely you, my dear fans, have the expectation that I'd live up to my title as self-proclaimed #1 theorist and provide you with an answer. Which perhaps puts me in the same position as Zayne. On day 1 of Demo 2, If we go and meet Zayne at his training, we can see for ourselves that he does put himself under a lot of pressure to put on a good show for his fans and live up to his reputation. And so, if he does that on the court, why wouldn't he wanna do it in the bed sheets? If you have picked up my drift, in this case, Zayne wouldn't be doing this to appease his own horniness, but to live up to the expectation that his fans has put on him as a playboy, which is a considerably stronger motivation to justify his enrollment in the porn club that comes with the added benefit of not making him a total dumbass for joining. This also ties into a subtle phrase that can be unlocked on the 4th day at the mess hall, in which he implies that he has joined Jock Studio to find new opportunities, which in this hypothesis would be new sexual opportunities. Considering the pressure he's under, he fears about how everyone sees him as this guy which surely must have a high body count. He'd feel like he needs to live up to that, and what better way of doing it than by joining Jock Studio? He has the chance to experience a bunch of different ways of having sex on the regular, without having to worry about people not being able to handle his size, because surely if they are in a porn club they are ready to handle his anaconda. I read of Zayne as someone that is always chasing after the success of living up to the expectation put on him not only perfectly matches the answer he gives in the quiz, but also fits the greater theme of expectations that Jock Studio seems to have. So Ace will, over time, help Zayne stop focusing on chasing after the external recognition and start to focus more on the things he actually needs, such as a stable and meaningful relationship, which, according to the quiz, is something Zayne never really seemed to have had. Clearly, however, this process will not be easy, by the simple reason that even if Zayne does seem to want a deep and meaningful bond with someone, in practice he always seems to put more values on those superficial wrong things he chases after. Like we see in the event outside the school gates. Zayne knows that being so openly flirty does eventually come back to bite him in the ass, and there's other people on top of it, but he does it anyway because he seems unable to resist the thrill of the emulation. For these reasons, I think it's very likely that the injury arc will be particularly significant for him, since out of all of the Jocks, Zayne seems to be the only one with any kind of pre-existing condition in the form of some kind of weakness in his shoulder that needs to be patched up with athlete tape. So an injury on this already weakened body part might just end up making him miss out on playing the mid-year championship, which means he also be ripped away from the spotlight and be forced to confront how much he actually values superficial things such as fame and praise, and how that has made him twist the way he acts to gain those things, to the point that they ended up affecting his self-image perhaps. This last scenario will be quite interesting from a story point of view, since it would present a case in which Zayne wants people to see him for who he really is, but at the same time the real Zayne also doesn't quite exist, considering that its self-identity is almost entirely defined by other people, so it'd be up to Ace to bring out a more genuine side to the star basketball player, to make him understand who he is without his fame and his fans, like we already seen Ace doing in the shower scene, where Zayne bursts out in genuine laughter after Ace calls him Zeddy Zeus, which prompts Zayne to reiterate how Ace's spontaneity seems to be the quality he admires the most about him, perhaps reflecting his own inability to just say what's on his mind. But as much as I'm finally able to say that for the first time it feels like I've probably cracked Zayne, there is one last element regarding his character that I can't quite discern at the current moment, that being why Zayne is so laser focused on living up to the expectations and standards of his fame. With the current amount of info given to us, it's not really possible to understand what makes him seek these sort of things. However, if you allow me to veer into headcanon territory for a minute, based off of Zayne's need to live up to his titles and the general theme around him of things not being what they look like, I dare to say that Zayne actually didn't start his life in a lap of luxury, since he was born as the legitimate child of a very wealthy man who had an affair that produced our dear basketball player. This would explain why Zayne has the life skills of the working class, since if he was born from an affair, it's likely that the paternity wasn't recognized right away, and he probably took years of legal battle on his mom's part to get her son properly recognized. Such scenario would also explain why Zayne is not particularly, or at least not overly attached to money, since before he got recognized as his father's son, Zayne probably lived with an average to below average income, but once he got access to his father's fortune, a money rush of sorts would have ensued, which however at some point ended when he realized that no matter how much cash he could throw around, it wouldn't necessarily fill the immaterial void he felt inside. This immaterial haul would have probably been due to his status as an illegitimate child, since from a very young age he had to prove himself as his father's child to have the money he needed to live, and that would undeniably kinda put the seed in young Zayne's mind that if he's not recognized by others, then he's worthless. Such situation might also be worsened by the fact that Zayne might also end up having a legitimate half-sibling, which would of course be the heir to most of their father's fortune, leaving Zayne feeling as if he needed to cut his own personal share of success. From this, he'd have started to try and succeed in basketball, which led him to being very popular, which led him to understand that he can easily get validation by being a total flirt, which led his fans to expect that he's a champion in their bedsheets as well, which circles us back to Zayne joining Jock Studio to prove himself as Alexander the Great in the bedroom too. With that, I say we have finally put the theory problem child to rest. So shall we move on to something a little easier perhaps? By that I mean the theory golden children who like to wear their secrets on their sleeve, making everything that much easier, because that's kinda what Yuuto and Leo tend to do. Yeah, in fact, Demo 2 not only gave us a surprisingly low amount of new information on these two, that wasn't already obvious or easily deductible from either context clues or the Demo 1 quiz, but also made it even more blatant what they will be struggling with during the course of their route. For this reason, giving the two of them an entirely separate section in this video wouldn't have really been justifiable in my eyes. Yuuto is still very much Yuuto. He's spontaneous, loudmouth, forgetful, he always means well, and finds himself more at ease with animals rather than with humans. All traits that further point to him having some kind of neurodivergence, which will likely be an important part of his story, and it will be something that not only might make him a target of bullying, but also his probably very Asian family will have a hard time coming to terms with it. And side note, hi, Trained Up from the future here. Turns out when it takes you an entire geological era to make a video, new updates are bound to roll out, and in this case, I can say that my suspicions on Yuuto's families have only been confirmed. Ryungo and Yoriko in fact seem to be indeed very traditionally Japanese, wearing classical Japanese outfits under their work coats, and they also adorn themselves with the same family crest Yuuto wears on his hips. Furthermore, from the icons around their reveal sketch and from the pins they proudly show off on their clothing, with the blue one clearly meant to resemble the NASA logo, is clearly supposed to be a big brain power couple in the field of aerospace engineering. And from the moment that they can afford to send their son at Olympus U, where tuition for the average person would probably cost an arm, a leg and one of every other body part, I'm willing to bet they are also quite the respected and relevant personalities inside the field. Ironically enough, however, their son is the last person in the world that should be allowed near any kind of space-like machinery, sans the risk of it going the way of SpaceX rockets even if it's just a kid's telescope, which is a fact I doubt his parents are too pleased by, considering that clearly the Nakajima family name is something that they seem to uphold with a lot of importance and a lot of honor. In spite of his lack of affinity with the subject, however, Yuuto's majors has always been listed as physics, highly relevant to learn how to not make rockets crash and burn, but a considerably difficult path for one's studies, even for the average person, let alone for somebody that cleans floors with lube. Yet, Yuuto is still doing it, despite the fact that it's clearly not something that aligns with his interests, let alone synchronizes with the way he functions. This, along with the academic app displaying the arts icon in Yuuto Pink, making it the only icon to not align with the respective Jock's field of studies, probably tell us that instead of picking up a major based on what he wants to do in life, he picked physics instead because he wanted to please his parents, who on their end I doubt force Yuuto directly down this path Hunter style, since the dev update does describe them as loving, but the real test for them will probably be having to face the reality that during the game, Yuuto will decide to deviate from the life path they always expected him to go down, and instead make his own choices, which his parents might not see as particularly worthy of the Nakajima name, since I did canon that he perhaps may want to do something related to dogs or even animals in general, since it seems to be something he has a lot of affinity with. So, in summary, this centers his route around the struggle of always being perceived as a failure and never quite managing to achieve what is expected of him, which is for sure largely due to his neurodivergence, which he has no fault in, but it certainly doesn't help that there might be people in his life that enable his lack of independence and organization. More on that in just a bit. Moving on to Leo, he also doesn't have much in the way of new info. He remains in large part in line with my previous prediction of him really struggling with FOMO, the fear of missing out. And in Demo 2 we saw him burn himself out to try and be present on every event he's invited to, which is exactly what I expected of him. The most relevant, if you can even call it that, new info on Leo is knowing that he didn't get to have many sweets growing up. Which could mean anything from his family not being able to afford it to his mom being super health conscious and thus restricting sweets from her kids. So not exactly solid evidence of one particular scenario over another. But I still maintain that he probably grew up in a large family, which gave him a powerful case of middle child syndrome. And now that he's an adult, he's left with a constant need to please that might end up becoming his downfall if he lets people take advantage of him. If you want a more in-depth theory on this too, I can link you up to my previous character theory video, since almost everything I said about these two back then is still valid. But just because Yuuto and Leo don't have anything interesting to discuss about themselves, doesn't mean they are not relevant to this discussion. I'd say in fact that the most interesting thing to come out of these two in the second demo is probably, well, their relationship with Avan. Speaking of middle children, Avan has always kinda been the middle child of the game when it comes to theories. He falls in this middle ground where, unlike Leo and Yuuto who have very little in the way of secrets, it's clear that Avan has parts of himself he likes to hide. But whatever these secrets are, they are clearly not as big as the ones from the Hank trio. And unlike the aforementioned, they don't seem to be overflowing by any means to the point that Avan can't hide them. Though of course, for us folks outside the fourth wall, we know for a fact that whatever Avan is hiding is significant enough to be a source of conflict later on in the story, but what that is exactly remains for us a little murky, unless we take a step back and try to look at the bigger picture. If we start a new game of Demo 2 and stalk, follow Avan around all week, we'll be able to discern something very interesting. On day 1, we can go and visit Avan during his training at the pool. After he showers, he'll tell Ace that he has a council meeting to attend to, and the same exact thing happens on day 2 after a group workout. And although we don't see Avan attending these meetings, we have pretty much no reason to doubt his word. This adherence to duty is also shown on day 3, where, presumably after having attended class in the morning, Avan can be found in the administrative building of the student council, preparing a lot of flyers. After that he goes to his practice, and after that still he ends up having to take care of Yuuto's mess who, having spilled soda on his bed, relies on Avan to change his sheets and also give him a bath. Lastly, on day 4, Avan spends some extra free time he has to do a bunch of laps at the pool, before going first to class and then to the club activities. In light of all of these events, saying that Avan's schedule is rather packed would be an understatement, and just so busy it becomes rather apparent once you compare his schedule to that of the other Jocks. All the other Jocks during their free time in Demo 2 are shown having a moment for themselves, or they say at least once they'll be doing something relaxing. Leo says he'll get to play video games with his friends, Yuuto gets to have fun at the park with the dogs, Bryce enjoys himself at the frat party, Dirks walks in the park after dusk, and Zayne always seems to have other plans, and these other plans are never implied to be anything work-related of sorts. And even still, the event with Leo on day 3 seems to have been a rather enjoyable moment for him. Avan instead, well, if he's not studying, he's dealing with council business. If he's not dealing with council business, he is exercising at at least a semi-professional level for the swim team. And if he's not doing that, he's basically acting as Yuuto's surrogate mom. How Avan manages to do all of that without going crazy is beyond me, and perhaps, you know what, maybe it's even beyond Avan himself. Surely having that packed of a schedule with essentially 4 different kinds of very demanding responsibility laid on your shoulder would drive anyone crazy. Even Avan himself often states that he is, in other people's opinion, an ardas, which is not hard to imagine how he might end up coming across that way if his stress levels are that high. So honestly, most people who would find themselves in Avan's shoes would probably not be able to retain their sanity without an outlet to relieve their stress, which is something that Avan, surprisingly, doesn't seem to have. Or does he? Remember how in my homophobia video I said that, like Zayne, it didn't make sense for Avan to have joined Jock's studio when, if he gets found out, it could cost him his position as president, not to mention expulsion? Well, in hindsight of Demo 2, Avan might have an understandable reason to join Jock Studio, and a very good one at that. Pardon my crudeness, but fucking might just be the way Avan gets to release his accumulated tension. It's probably his way of coping with his high-stress life, and I wouldn't be surprised if Jock Studio is not his first go-around at something like this. Not that he did porn in the past, mind you, but during the closet scene, for example, Avan seems to know exactly what he wants, like wanting Ace to touch his pecs, for example. So Avan, literally and figuratively, forces his hand. And in the shower group scene from day one, it almost appears to me that even if trying to seduce Ace makes Avan feel silly, the art of seduction does seem like something our dear swimmer has experience with. So what I'm suggesting, which is more of a logical guess, is that Avan is probably a guy with a sizable amount of sexual experience, due to the fact that hookups and the like are the way in which he releases the pressure of his stressful life. Following this hypothesis, I wouldn't be surprised if during the story, Ace would end up walking in on Avan at the city's strip club in a rather, let's say, compromising position with another guy, or two, or three, or how many guys Avan manages to take on at once. In light of this discovery on Ace's part, the fact that Avan might have such a high body count could make for an interesting conflict, especially since it might put a dent in what Ace sees as the commitment Avan has in their blossoming relationship. But at this point we might ask, why Avan keeps himself so busy if he needs an outlet as powerful as hoeing around to relieve his stress? Couldn't he just thin out his schedule? And that's a perfectly valid point. Surely Avan can't give up on his studies, and he can't give up on the dream team either because it's probably an important part of the curriculum at Olympus U. But the student council business and taking care of Yuuto? Those are things that he could in theory opt out of. So why does he keep on doing them even if it causes him so much stress? So I think it's now time to circle back to Yuuto's lack of independence. At first glance, the dynamic between the two of them seems kinda obvious. Yuuto depends on Avan like a child would depend on a parent. And even if Avan doesn't quite take care of Yuuto to that level, he still assumes a very active role in keeping Yuuto in check and making sure he doesn't mess up big time, or at least he makes sure he's there to contain the damage. So the question now comes naturally, why would Avan go to such extreme extent to take care of Yuuto? It's not established, beyond a very vague line that is probably just a reference, if Avan and Yuuto knew each other prior to their enrollment at Olympus U. But regardless, even if you were to assume that they have been childhood best friends, what Avan does for Yuuto is not something that even a best friend would be willing to do. Think about it. If you shared a room with somebody as 20-something-year-olds, even if this person was your greatest best friend, would you be willing to do their laundry for them? Would you be willing to change their sheets when they get them dirty? Would you be willing to take the bother of switching out the mattress of their bed to an inflatable one so that when, and not if, it gets dirty, it's easier to clean? Would you be willing to straight up get in the bathtub with them and wash them because otherwise they are not gonna do it themselves? Sure, some of these actions alone might end up sounding like favors one does to a friend, but all of them together? They are no longer just favors, they are a pattern. So there must be a reason why Avan takes on the responsibility of caring for Yuuto on top of his already busy schedule. And the reason is actually quite easy to spot, and it seems to be validation. As much as he might try to hide it during the Wednesday scene, we know from the quiz that the frustration Avan must feel towards the people that don't appreciate his job is probably as palpable as the gratitude Avan has for Ace, when a blue-haired protagonist not only helps him out but reassures the swimmer that what he does is important. This reflects into the relationship Avan has with Yuuto, turning it from a dependent relationship to a codependent relationship. Yuuto needs Avan to function, but Avan, and pardon the incoming repetition, needs Yuuto to need him because that's a very easy way for Avan to feel validated, and what's more validating than taking care of someone in need? But despite the two of them filling up each other's needs perfectly, this is still not a healthy dynamic for the two of them to have, especially long term. Because if it continues, Yuuto will never learn to do things on his own, and Avan will only keep on adding more stress to his already stressed life. So it is quite possible that breaking this codependency will be a key issue Ace will need to address in both Yuuto's and Avan's route. So I'd say that at this point we've understood what will be Avan's core problem that will probably be addressed in the first narrative arc dedicated to him. But when I say that Avan's core problem is the constant need for validation, it might sound a bit familiar, since another character is already defined by his need for validation, and he is none other than Natsumi, of course. And well, also seemingly Leo. But in general, the similarity between these three are a dozen plenty. All three of them are highly productive people, which are highly involved with their respective establishment. They thrive whenever they can do lots of things at once, and by all accounts they are very reliable people. Though in all three of them, all of these qualities seem to have been born, at least initially, from a need of validation, which will make their storylines kinda redundant with each other, especially between Leo and Avan, which are in the same game. Speaking of these two in particular, Leo's and Avan's storylines potentially being very similar to each other is a slightly worrying notion. But fear not, because once we look at more clues, it allows us to differentiate them in a subtle but meaningful way. By digging through the quiz answers, we can already see how Leo seems to be more so interested in wanting to be included. Whatever he does it because he wants inclusion, which in itself is a form of validation, but it's also not just validation. It's community, it's a sense of belonging that isn't necessarily tied to one's skills. Sometimes it can be, like we saw in the night event of day 3, where Leo goes an extra mile to make sure his friends do less work. But more often than not, it can be just as simple as always showing up whenever someone makes plans. This attitude in turn can make Leo, however, into a bit of a doormat, since by his own admission in the quiz, what probably happens when he is made to feel excluded is that he bends the knee as much as he can to please as much as possible, which will surely be a source of conflict during the story if he lets people take advantage of him that way. Avan is instead more so focused on validation brought about by performance, by skill and by what, in his eyes, is the admiration he deserves but he never seems to get. And whenever he doesn't get it, he, by his own admission in the quiz, gets emotional and holds grudges. Which, however, can be a bit of a double-edged sword, because if on one hand Avan might be justified in getting mad at the people that don't recognize his work, on the other it can make him blind to even constructive criticism, which are certainly both scenarios we'll explore in the final game, but each of them still highlights how much Avan ties his self-worth to his work. However, simply explaining the differences between Leo and Avan doesn't take into account that a plot about seeking validation would be an already done storyline for Blitz games, not to mention that it would be, for a second time, tied to an aquatically inclined scholarly boy. Despite this, it's not impossible that they decide to give this kind of storyline a second shot, for the simple reason that Natsumi's route in Camp Buddy isn't really that good, at least when compared to the others. According to the Camp Buddy journal, Natsumi's route was the last one to be written when the devs were in the process of developing Camp Buddy, and in my opinion it shows, since in general everything that revolves around Yuuto, which is without a doubt the central conflict generator of the story, does come off as a little weak when compared to how impactful it should have actually been. So I wouldn't really be surprised if the devs decided to give this storyline a second shot. But of course, they'll not be trying to recreate it one-on-one. Instead, they seem to have divided the elements of validation seeking and brotherly comparison to put them on two different characters. More on that later. So, now that we've concluded without a doubt that Avan's storyline will be centered around validation, would it perhaps be wise of us to try and deduce how things might be resolved in the end? Try to uncover the root of the problem Ace will need to eradicate? Well, sadly that's not an easy task, and dare I say once again, with the amounts of info so far provided, it's impossible to say for certain. The only deduction that I feel confident in saying is that Avan's parents or guardians are the kind of people that never, and I mean never, complimented their son for his successes. I can totally see it being also somewhat of a mirror situation with Yuuto's parents, who are probably more towards the "you are a disgrace with everything that you do" line of thinking, while Avan's parents, as I said, will more so never care about what Avan does, for better or for worse. And if we head off in pure headcanon territory, and base it off this one quiz answer I find intriguing, I can think of a possible reason for why Avan's parents might not pay him any attention. In a sort of reverse Natsumi situation, The attentions of Avan's parents might always be elsewhere because Avan might have a sibling, older or younger matters little, that maybe is and always has been sick, or maybe he's not fully autonomous, which makes Avan always end up as an afterthought for his parents. This idea might also play on why Avan is so good at taking care of Yuuto, because he's used to helping out taking care of his sibling back home, so it would come natural to him. And this scenario would also create some interesting conflict for Avan, since he'd need to deal with the contrasting feelings of loving his sibling, but also grapple with the fact that they are the reason for why he's always ignored by their parents. So, in summary, Avan works really hard in everything he does, because he ties his self-value as a person to the success of his work. Yet, due to an upbringing in which he never felt validated, it's never enough for Avan, which brings him only to add more work and more stress to his already busy life, leading him down a path of seeking sex as a coping mechanism. So it will be up to Ace over the course of the game to not only teach Avan how to actually get some relaxation, but also make sure he can always feel validated, regardless of his successes or his failures. Whew, that was quite the long one to unpack, but luckily for me, the next boy is considerably more straightforward.
Oh, brother!
Yeah, stop it like that, because that's exactly what we're gonna talk about. Bryce's bro, aka Brody, has a grand total of only 2 mentions across solely Demo 2. And yet somehow his mere existence is enough for us to speculate plenty on him. First of all, let's get the basics facts out of the way. Brody is in the likely mentioned first doing a Monday event at the wrestling club, where Bryce says that he doesn't want his bro to see him with Ace, letting us deduce, with a considerable degree of certainty, that Brody is also a part of the wrestling club. He's also mentioned a second time on the Thursday event at the University Center, but that doesn't really give us much to work with deductions wise, besides letting us know that Brody is probably the one between the Callahan siblings that does the laundry. For more info about him, we can instead turn to his design, and judging from his questionable, not to say aberrant, choice of outfit, it's not hard to see that he's as every bit as fratty as Bryce. From the trashy shirt to the cringe necklace to the fact that his default pose seems to constantly have the middle finger up, it's not hard to imagine that Brody could easily win the gold medal for most annoying character in the game. A feat in which he seems to have gotten a head start, since his signature color seems to be gold, being present on both his chain and his hat, which are clearly meant to match Bryce's. But let's not get hung up on the bling just yet, because for how annoying Brody might be, we also need to take into account that he's probably one of few characters that might actually pose a real threat to Ace. We can in fact assume that when, during Bryce's route, Ace will join the wrestling club, he'll probably be doing so against his better judgment, since if Bryce is to be believed, a queer twerp, the likes of Ace, might just be swimming in homophobia-infested waters if he decides to join wrestling. Now, granted, we have no way of knowing for certain if Bryce's worries are completely justified under this aspect, since there is the not insignificant possibility that he might be letting the paranoia get the better of him and blowing out of proportion the negative reaction his fellow wrestlers might have towards queerness. But at the same time, it'd be naive to assume that everybody would be totally accepting, due to the simple counterpoint that, shall we say, the kind of crowd Bryce seems to associate with would very much fall under the traditional definition of homophobic bastards, if Bryce's own behavior is anything to go by. On the flip side of this same coin, however, considering the wrestling club as a monolith would be an equally wrong assumption, and taking into account the size of Olympus U, chances are there will be some legitimately nice people among the wrestlers, which I'll assume Ace will befriend quite quickly once he'll actually join. Making new friends, however, would only mildly alleviate the situation Ace will have with Bryce, with the latter not only probably forcing Ace to deal with his internalized homophobia for a good chunk of the early game, but since Brody's presence around Bryce is basically guaranteed in most occasions, Ace's daily dose of homophobia might just end up being doubled. And unlike Bryce's, I think that Brody's brand of homophobia has the potential of being considerably more externalized. Such situation also seems to be compounded by the fact that Daddy Callahan, aka Bruce, seems to be surprisingly present in his sons' lives, due to the fact that he has been one of the first side characters to have been revealed and thus designed. so he's likely to be around for a fair bit through the entire course of Bryce's route, maybe in virtue of the fact that perhaps he worked at Olympus U. So his presence would not just end up being an additional threat to Ace, but also another source of anxiety for Bryce, who not only needs to guard himself from being outed by his comrades and his bro, but if his father were to catch wind of his queerness or his involvement with Jock Studio, there is no telling for sure which kind of dire consequences it might entail, especially since from his sketch he already looks like such a totally relaxed and understanding person. Let's not, however, get all doom and gloom here, because although it might be tempting to speculate all day on the kind of tribulations homophobia will put Bryce through, if you know me, that's not exactly my vibe, nor it has ever been Blitz's vibe either for that matter. As I've stated in my now debunked homophobia-less word theory video, Blitz's previous titles, the Camp Buddies, were, in the developer's own words, trailblazers. Because,
you know, we grew up with a lot of whenever there was any BL or yaoi content, it was always towards the, quite frankly, darker end of the spectrum. And it was definitely, you know, I think one of their big goals and one of our big goals when I joined the team to make something that was more brighter and more positive and like a more of a positive influence on people rather than, you know, focusing on that more negative side of the BL that, you know, a lot of people do.
And while Jock Studio is...
Jock Studio is the perfect transition after this project, and then we can tackle even more and more mature themes as we grow as a company and as more time goes on.
But, just because it tackles more mature subjects doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't remain a queer escapism game. The whole starting premise of the game is, after all, already somewhat of a gay power fantasy. Either any of you watching right now do not have wished at least once that you could have a gay porn club in your own college too, and so making Bryce's whole route revolve entirely around homophobia would be quite the tone killer, especially compared to the others. Not to mention that, although I was ultimately proven wrong in regards of the Jock Studio universe being a homophobia-less one, I still stand by the fact that a big reason why the Camp Buddies managed to be so captivating is that they presented a fresh take on queer storytelling, one that wasn't tied down by the unfortunately negative experiences that come with being queer in real life. Assuming that Blitz would wanna stay on brand and replicate the previous successes, if Bryce's storyline was really all about him dealing with his homophobic family, its freshness level would be equivalent to Bryce's armpit after a workout. So, in light of all of these factors, I still feel inclined to refuse the notion that the entirety of Bryce's arc will revolve around homophobia and only homophobia. Stories like that are already a dozen plenty, and although when done well they are both needed and effective, going down that route for a character is hardly innovative. So there must be something else to Bryce's arc. Something that, dare I say, will end up being even more relevant than homophobia by the end of it. And, if you have been paying attention, you might have picked up on a crucial detail I have intentionally omitted for now about the relationship between Bryce and Brody. Since the two of them are not just brothers, they are twins, which considerably shuffles the cards around when it comes to the dynamic between the two of them. Because having a twin, especially a twin of your same gender, is not like having just a regular sibling. Because when you have a twin, there is always the expectation that, you know what, I think there are more qualified people than me to tell you about it.
And as twins, we're expected to have the same things. If she got a car, I would get a car. If she got straight A's, everyone would look to me and expect me to get straight A's. But
people think we're so similar, where people are like, yeah, it's one of the quads, you know. If one of them does this, I bet you the other one does that too. We definitely think differently on a lot of stuff, and we act differently, and so used to people just only looking at the similarities in us.
I hope you see where this is going, because at this point, it should be rather evident. Although homophobia is probably one of the reasons why Bryce has a hard time accepting himself as queer, the main reason for why he's so closed off is probably that he feels like he must be like his twin in every possible way. They must play the same sport, have the same friends, go to the same parties, and like the same things even when it comes to dating preferences. This dynamic between the Callahan twins not only might be Blitz's second shot at a brotherly comparison story after the Hamasaki siblings left room for improvement, but it appears to be reflected even in the colors of Bryce's and Brody's accessories. Those matching chains and hats have the very notable difference that Brody's are gold, the color of winners of first places, while Bryce's are silver, the color of second place, indicating, in a sense, Bryce's subordinate position to Brody, who is probably the one that takes the lead in most cases and shapes most of their shared identity. Mind you, not saying that Bryce's whole entire life is a lie. He clearly does enjoy the frat life that he lives, with all the parties and the booze, but that clearly doesn't stop him from needing to carve out his own sense of identity, even if he probably lives this entire desire for self-actualization as a guilt. Bryce has been conditioned to truly think that the right thing to do is to be as much as like his brother as possible, and even the slightest differences are probably, in his eyes, something that must be fixed. But how can I say it for certain, you may ask? Well, rather simply, I think it's rather blatant during Bryce's event with Derek. In fact, Bryce in this event has asked Derek to help him get rid of his excess belly fat, which when you have a body such as Bryce, seems like a rather insignificant matter. But for Bryce, it's probably quite the heavy issue, since, presumably, Brody doesn't have excess belly fat, perhaps thanks to a metabolism that is just a little more efficient. So Bryce sees this difference as a problem that needs to be fixed right away. Yet Bryce can't simply follow Derek's advice of having a change of diet, because if Brody can have a flat belly while still drinking and eating junk, Bryce too must have a flat belly while drinking and eating junk. So if a matter as trivial as a bit of excess body fat is enough for Bryce to feel inadequate, think of the stress that being into things Brody isn't into would cause Bryce. Like being into comic books. Brody would never have such a nerdy and loser hobby, so Bryce shuts that passion away and relegates it to his choice of underwear. And, more relevantly, the main thing that Bryce is shutting away about himself is his queerness. Even once Bryce will peel off the delicious layer of homophobia, he'll still be left with the creeping fear that not being like his twin is just not right. After all, being like Brody as much as possible is just everything he has ever known, so deviating from that will be hard on him. And certainly, his family won't make it any easier. Now, so far I've painted Brody and Bruce in a pretty bad light, but as much as they are shaping up to be the antagonists of Bryce's story, I doubt that the Callahans are such a bad batch after all. Although to a degree it would be compelling to see Bryce shake off of himself a family that, no matter what, would never understand him for his choice of being his own person, it wouldn't be as compelling as seeing Brody and Bruce be three-dimensional people that, although will certainly end up hurting Bryce with their actions, that won't mean that they aren't capable of changing to accept Bryce for who he truly is. This latter scenario would be fresher, it would be more complex, and would conclude Bryce's route, at least in the good endings, on a hopeful and positive note, rather than a more depressing one, since, at the end of the day, even if cutting off toxic family members is a good thing, it's also a sign that what was supposed to be one of the most important relationships in somebody's life has been broken beyond repair, which isn't exactly pleasant to hear. With this in mind, even if Brody might end up being a dickhead for most of the game, we need to keep in mind that if Bryce equals Brody, Brody equals Bryce. So I wouldn't be surprised to know that, like Bryce, what really upsets Brody deep down is not that his brother is queer, is that they are no longer alike. I'm sure that, to some level, Brody equates the two of them being alike to a certainty that gives him comfort. No matter what he'll be doing in life, he'll not be doing it alone. And if Bryce will no longer be like him in all aspects, that is a certainty that will falter. But I'm nonetheless sure that it will be the sheer fear of no longer being alike that will ultimately end up becoming a common ground for the twins to find a way to reconcile. Even in spite of all the hurt that Brody might have caused Bryce, if Brody truly loves his bro like I think he does, he will be able to look past his own homophobia and his own fears to make sure that even if they'll be different, it won't mean that they won't have each other's backs at all times.
As much as we are together and as much as we do stuff, now the Taylors are gonna change going off to school and stuff, but we'll always have something that can't be broken. We'll always share stuff that will never change, even if we're not as a part of each other's lives as we have been for the past 18 years.
In all of this, I presume that Bruce will end up somewhat caught in the crossfire between his two sons. Considering all the importance that the twin dynamic will have in Bryce's route, I assume that his relationship with Brody will have the most focus and thus be the greatest source of conflict in the story, leaving Bruce as an onlooker as his two boys will turn on each other in what could end up being a series of relationship-severing fights. However, as their shared father, who presumably had to raise his boys on his own since Mrs. Callahan seems to either be happily divorced or dead, pick your poison, I doubt that at the end of the day Bruce will let hate cloud his heart, and he will end up playing a crucial role in letting his sons reconcile, and perhaps along the way he'll try to make up for the many mistakes he clearly made while raising his sons. At least in the good endings, that is. If you instead want everything to go to shit in the bad endings, feel free to do so. It's the beauty of player freedom. With that, I think we can wrap up Bryce, making it time to end with none other than our most popular jock, our dear Daddy Derek the King. Sorry, pardon me, Mr. Derek. I know that you don't really like when people call you Daddy, especially since, in spite of my old predictions, you are not an actual daddy. In fact, basically every last one of my old predictions about you has been wrong, so let's scrap all that and start from scratch. And I'd indeed say that Derek's clear disdain for being called Daddy and for serial nicknames is a good jumping off point, since a good chunk of the wrong responses Ace can give through the course of Derek's suit are about that. This by itself is not entirely surprising. It has always been rather evident that Derek doesn't exactly revel in his past as a porn actor, so somebody calling him a nickname that probably reminds him of a darker time in his life wouldn't exactly be pleasurable for him. But why exactly would his time spent as a porn actor be so full of pain? After all, it's not like we think about some guy Derek associated himself with that allows us to get a complete picture of what this seemingly very painful past looks like. The Monday practice and the heart-to-heart Wednesday event once more proved themselves to be the most relevant out of all the interactions, since in both of them, Derek makes mention of a certain person that he used to know but that he is clearly no longer in contact with. In the case of the park event, Derek specifically mentions that the person he's talking about is an Ace's lookalike, which on top of looking exactly like Ace, in case it wasn't obvious enough already, is also kinda at this point undeniably Derek's ex, since our quarterback admits that this mystery person was a handsome guy, which, coupled with the blushing on his face as he said so, I think reading between the lines becomes rather easy at this point. In regards of the event in the lockers, however, it is not specified by Derek if Ace's lookalike and the person that was so eager to do porn are one and the same, but still, I'd say it's a pretty safe bet to say that they are, because I don't really think there is enough space in the story for two separate people that would come back from Derek's past to haunt him. So that leaves us with the notion that Derek probably used to have a boyfriend he did porn with, which is certainly interesting but not very revolutionary. So for this reason, I need to call your attention to what would be the probable timeline of events in Derek's life. Derek himself states that he knew Ace's lookalike from his first time at Olympus University, highlighting how the most logical sequence of events in Derek's life is that he first got enrolled at Olympus U, then made Ace's lookalike, and lastly he started his porn career. And this career would have probably lasted a short but intense 2 years, in which Derek probably dropped out of school, because had he been balancing both studies and porn, I doubt he would have seemingly had a meteoric rise as this once-in-a-generation porn star. Then, after those 2 years passed, Derek dropped out of porn and went back to Olympus U to finish his degree, which now makes him a senior of 24 years instead of the 22 he would have had if he had not been occupied with porn for 2 years. However, within such timeline, there are a lot of missing whys. Chief among them, why Derek dropped out of porn in the first place when he was not only famous, but also presumably making a fortune with that fame. And although I do have an answer to that, to get to it we need to look at one of Derek's defining characteristics first, which is, without a doubt, the way he seems to be so fiercely protective over Ace. Derek always wants to be there to make sure Ace feels comfortable and ready for whatever is about to happen, which, if you put 2 and 2 together, this could be read as Derek projecting his ex onto Ace. It only makes sense after all. If anybody were to meet a person that looks exactly like a person they are/were close to, one's mind is bound to project part of the personalities of that person on their lookalike. If it looks like a duck, it must also quack like a duck, right? So it's likely that Derek, on a subconscious level, treats Ace in the way he'd be treating his ex if he'd be standing right in front of him. And it is certainly a little odd, however, that Derek, out of all the possible feelings in the world, ends up projecting protectiveness on Ace. If in part that is certainly Derek just wanting to guide the younger boy and be a sort of mentor to him, if he's projecting onto Ace the protectiveness he'd wanna direct to his ex-boyfriend, what would exactly be the thing that his ex-BF needs to be protected from? Presumably, Derek's ex is just as old as him, if not older, so he wouldn't really need to be babied around. Unless, well... I mean, we see Derek say that his ex's eagerness seemed to have led to something not so nice, and with all the protectiveness Derek shows in regards of Ace's first time filming a sex scene, and the fact that we know that Derek and his ex were both involved in porn, it is likely that something really unpleasant happened to Derek's ex. So it's not really looking pretty for Ace's lookalike, and on what that might be, I'd exclude Ace on principle, since I think that would really be too dark for the game, but I had thought of two alternative options nonetheless. One, Ace's lookalike got taken advantage of by somebody else in some way that was not sexual, but was still very serious and Derek was unable to stop it or do anything about it. Or two, something happened while Derek and his BF were recording together. An incident which might have something to do with fisting. Which, in case you don't know, is exactly what it sounds like. And it's a stunt Derek might have pulled off in the past, from the moment that his arm tattoo is usually a signifier among porn stars of how far one has managed to put his arm up, you know what I mean. So I can totally see Ace's lookalike being eager to get fisted by his boyfriend, but considering Derek's arm size and that Ace's lookalike might not have had the elasticity of an experienced professional, I can easily see something ripping, shall I say. Regardless of what actually happened, with Derek being the sweetheart that he is, I don't really see a scenario in which he isn't racked with guilt for what he did or didn't do to prevent whatever kind of bad experience his ex ended up suffering. And I also don't see a scenario in which Ace's lookalike isn't badly affected by this event, because no matter how you put it, whatever happened to him must have been pretty traumatic and maybe even scarring. That's undeniably a sad situation and perfectly fitting with the onion description Derek gives himself in the quits. And I assume that something like that would end up inevitably affecting the relationship between the two men, to the point that it broke down completely, which, along with the guilt, would have been the main reasons for why Derek stopped with the whole porn thing. So now we not only understand why Derek dropped out of porn, but also why he's so laser focused on protecting Ace, with this latter quality certainly being a sign of chivalry, but the fact that this might stem from such a traumatic situation might lead to some unintended side effects. At the current moment, one might end up falsely believing that Derek is not exactly a man of many flaws. Compared to the other Jocks which tend to wear their negative traits on their sleeve, Derek doesn't seem to present a flaw as obvious as Leo's pushoverness, Yuuto's forgetfulness, or Bryce's, Bryceness. However, a flaw can oftentimes also be an excess in quality, and in the case of Derek, an excess in protectiveness can oftentimes become oppressing and bear the name of overprotectiveness. Although certainly justified to a degree because rooted in trauma, I wouldn't be surprised if Derek's desire to keep Ace safe would, further on in the game, start to manifest as controlling behavior, with Derek always wanting to know where Ace is, what he's doing and with who he's hanging out with, to the point that he doesn't really realize that this behavior is rather toxic, and it will be up to Ace to make him realize how oppressive he's being, and to make him open up more about the terrible event that led him to being so overly concerned for Ace's safety. So with that, I say we can conclude here and... No, you know what? I'm not satisfied with this conclusion. Not one bit. And you know why? Because it's too damn similar to Taiga's storyline, with having one of the exes doing or not doing something that makes the other get hurt, and by the magic of friendship then in the present they are able to put the past behind themselves and reconcile. Of course, this is a bit of an oversimplification of Taiga's storyline, but, much like in the case of the Yamasaki brothers, Blitz wouldn't just straight up recycle a storyline like that. So there must be something else that allows us to differentiate the two. And if my instincts aren't playing tricks on me, the secret difference is in Derek's balls. Not the footballs, the ball. If we pay attention, we can notice how, at the end of Derek's BJ scene, our football player states that nobody ever touches balls. Which is, to put it bluntly, a fucking insane statement coming from a porn star. However, when you think about it, this claim on Derek's part that nobody ever touches balls actually speaks volumes to the kind of experience he probably had in the porn industry. Considering that Derek had a very meteoric rise, it was already reasonable to assume that, in some way, the people around him, so producers, directors, etc., intentionally constructed the image of the king to have as wide of appeal as possible. This by itself is not entirely surprising. Porn actors are still actors, and as such their public image is bound to differ compared to who they actually are in private. So, as we could already imagine from Ace saying that Derek is very dominating in films but caring in person, the king was probably the typical dumb daddy sort of actor, but the fact that nobody ever touches balls like that perhaps highlights just how extreme the dumb daddy persona was. If the king's balls have truly never been touched, it would be reasonable to assume that all of his movies followed a very similar script, with Derek being a dominant top that takes charge and teaches a lesson to his bottom. And it's probably this adherence to the script that was, in all likeness, strictly enforced, that stopped Derek from experiencing more variety in sex beyond just shove your dick down a hole as hard as you can. This perspective also explains his general dislike of rough sex, since having sex like that probably makes Derek feel like he's working. But with that said, although this is clearly a very interesting aspect of his character, it still does not fully explain why Derek never got his balls touched before. Because sure, on film he had to stick by the script in which he fully dominated the actor that bottoms, but as I said, private and performance are very different for actors, and Derek did have a boyfriend for presumably at least some of the time he was in the industry. So, by all logic, if the two of them had a regular sex life, in which they don't have to perform for the camera, why hasn't Ace's lookalike touched Derek's balls in the past? If you exclude the, for obvious reasons, very unlikely scenario that Ace's lookalike is asexual, why in the world would Derek's boyfriend, over the course of a 2-ish year relationship, have never ever touched Derek's balls? Especially since we know that Derek prefers more of a comfortable and romantic experience when he's under the private bedsheets. So why wouldn't his boyfriend give that to him? He wouldn't be that good of a boyfriend if he never ever satisfied Derek with what he wanted. Unless... no unless. Derek never getting his balls touched in his life means that his boyfriend never did it to him, which is rather strange and worrying, since touching testicles is such a common thing to do that it kinda makes it seem as the two of them maintain their kind of performative rough sex even in their private lives. When you consider, however, that Derek doesn't seem to be too fond of this way of having sex, then the imposition that they must adhere to the BDSM dumb daddy script in their private lives must have come from Ace's lookalike. Sure, one might say, but maybe Derek in the past disliked BDSM and sex less than he does now. And to that I'd say that although that's possible, people also don't tend to change their taste much when it comes to what is done in the bedroom. It's difficult to obtain an acquired taste for that sort of stuff. So even if Derek might have tolerated, it wouldn't have been his first choice. As another point in favor of Derek's past sexual experiences being only tied to dumb ladies' fantasies, there is also to be taken into account that if Derek's sex has always been so monothematic, it will allow the relationship he has with Ace to grow significantly even under the sexual aspect, since it will mean that Derek too might experience many firsts when having sex with Ace, and he'll have for the first time the chance to have a say in how he wants to have sex. However, this is exactly what I find rather worrying. The fact that Derek never seemed to have had any input in the way he wanted to have sex, even with Ace's lookalike, which was his boyfriend, might just be a symptom of a bigger problem in their relationship. I hope that everyone watching knows that a relationship, especially a romantic one, is oftentimes made of compromises in all spheres that it envelops, including the sexual one. So if Ace's lookalike was the one who always made the decision when it came to sex, and Derek just agreed to everything, which makes it consensual, just unfair on one of the parties, what's stopping us from assuming that this was happening in other areas of their relationship as well? Ace's lookalike might have had a significant influence on Derek in the sense that he was always the one making decisions and influencing Derek, being the sort of dominant half in the relationship between the two. And at this point, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that it was Ace's lookalike the one who convinced Derek to do porn in the first place. On this note, we can also notice how, if this is the case, such behavior would probably make Ace's lookalike somewhat of a rebel, since he was a student at the prestigious Olympus University that actually harbored a secret desire to do porn, and dropped out to do so. By this logic, if his influence on Derek was indeed as strong as it seems, it's likely that Derek too made his choice as an act of rebellion, and it really appears like he did since he has the scars to prove the submersive motive behind his career choice. These scars in question being Derek's tattoos, of which I've never been able to make any sense out of, since under the old assumption that Derek never saw porn as a long-time career for himself and wanted to slip back into the shadows once he was done with it, it didn't make sense for him to get big-ass super recognizable tattoos while actively being a porn star. But in the wake of the realization that Ace's lookalike had a substantial rebellious influence on Derek, it seems likely that Derek getting those tattoos might have been another act of rebellion on his part to go along with his new free life as a porn actor. And if I may add a bit of extra speculation, maybe what Derek rebelled from was a highly overprotective family, since this would not only make for an interesting mirror with Derek being overprotective towards Ace in the present, but it would also make sense because oftentimes, the more one tries to suppress one's child, the more likely they are to rebel and, oftentimes, end up in the arms of less than trustworthy people. But let's not get our fact twisted. Although it is certainly nice that Ace's lookalike represented an escape for Derek, the reason why we came to this conclusion in the first place is that his influence on our Red Hunk wasn't always to Derek's benefit. And to further prove that, I need to go back to the notion that Derek projects a lot of his ex onto Ace. Another thing that seems to be rather strange about the way Derek acts around Ace are Derek's reaction after he makes a mistake. More specifically, I find the way he beats himself up for scaring Ace at the park to be rather excessive, and he seems to treat it as if he made who knows what kind of terrible act instead of just an honest mistake. Granted, it was the second time it happened, but the way he beats himself up over it still feels honestly unfair. And this unfairness towards oneself is usually typical of people that are used to receiving excessive consequences for their mistakes. So if Derek is projecting his ex onto Ace, it probably means that he was used to receiving overblown reaction from his boyfriend whenever he ended up doing something wrong. As you can see, this isn't shaping up to be a healthy relationship dynamic at all, since it seems that Ace's lookalike essentially took advantage of Derek's vulnerable state as a sheltered person in the position to make his own choices for the first time, to make him follow him in the porn industry, and once they were boyfriends, he not only treated Derek abysmally on an emotional level, probably making him feel like he was always walking on eggshells, but also restricted his sex life by never letting Derek express his own desires. And I hope that your memory serves you right here, because if Derek was used to receiving a lot of consequences for small mistakes, can you imagine what his BF would have done to him for the big mistake that seemingly made Derek quit porn for good? It would have quickly become an endless sea of guilt tripping, the likes of "you did nothing to help me, you don't care," or "you did this to me," to the point that it might have actually backfired on Ace's lookalike, and instead of keeping his boyfriend trapped with him forever, Derek ended up believing that his BF was better off without him, which would have made him leave both the relationship and his position as a once-in-a-generation porn star. At this point, however, Derek wouldn't really have had anybody else to turn to, since due to Ace's lookalike negative influence, Derek would have never thought his family would forgive him for abandoning them. So he used whatever money he had left to go back to university and turn his life around, where he started to work as a part-time personal trainer to support himself in his day-to-day needs, since presumably his saving from being the king wouldn't last him forever. So as I've explained through the last however many minutes, Derek probably has a lot of baggage that needs to be unpacked. From the way he perceives his own self-guilt to his overprotective behavior, it all seems to lead back to his ex-boyfriend in one way or another. Consequentially, understanding that his ex's nasty actions are not excusable by whatever trauma Ace's lookalike might have endured will be a key component of Derek's roots, and when X eventually shows up in the game's story, Derek will need the strength to not only not fall under his spell again, but wrathfully cut him off once and for all. Such event could perhaps also tie into Derek reconnecting with his family, now that he finally understands what it's like being both the overprotected and the overprotector, and so it will be easier for him to forgive the mistakes of the past and start anew. A storyline that would, as such, entirely revolve around the concept of a toxic ex is a rather more than a relevant topic to discuss, along with not letting other people take advantage of you, and not overworking yourself for those that don't care, and being proud of your own self-identity, and not being ashamed of making mistakes, and not chasing after superficial things that don't actually make you happy. So yeah, I'd say we have a fairly modern lineup. So that concludes it for now. Remember to take all of the stuff you've heard in these videos as simple theories, that as such can end up being wrong at any moment, especially the canon sections, since I've included them mainly to give you guys a possible idea for a storyline, even if it's not exceedingly likely that those specific backstories will be the ones the dev team has decided to go down with. With that said, remember to like this video and subscribe if you want to see more from me, and if you are at least 18 years old, you can pass by my Reddit where I post daily polls on Jock Studios, as well as manual theories when new info comes out. Remember to also check out my amazing artist Erin, who did the thumbnail and my avatar for this video, and a big thanks to my co-theorists, Steph and Joshee, and my assistants, Everdin and Novel Reader, who all helped to make this video possible. I was your host Raindrop, and this has been Jock Studio is full of trauma!